Lord, may the words on my lips, the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable unto you, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. And amen. Some of you might remember the children's prayer that some of you might have said as you went to bed. Now I lay me down to sleep. Pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take. Some of you are familiar with that one. It's really a horrible prayer. Teaching it 3 or 4 or 5-year-old. I think we had our children learning that one. Did you do that one, Gary?
Did you hear the other version of that?
What's that one?
Now I lay me down to sleep, I can feel it at my feet. If I should die before I wake, I die of a tummy ache.
I haven't heard that one. The story that I was going to tell was the one of the father who was doing prayers with his young son, and his young son is used to doing that prayer and gets it mixed up a little bit. He says, now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should wake before I die. And he realizes he's made a mistake. And his father says to him, he says, no, I really like that version. If I should wake before I die is something that I pray for you, that you wake before you die. That's really what our parable is about today. It's about waking up to living God's way before we die. It's a story of two very different lives that end into vastly different eternal destinies. We have on one hand, we have a poor beggar named Lazarus. Lazarus, not to be confused with the Lazarus who Jesus raised from the dead, although it's interesting that Jesus chose the same name. And an unnamed rich man who refused to help Lazarus. On earth, Lazarus received compassion only from the dogs. We read in the story that the dogs licked his wounds, and in doing so helped his healing. But he got very little love or attention or care or compassion from humans. Lazarus dies. His fortunes are quite reversed. He goes off to heaven for his eternal rewards. The rich man dies, and his fortune is reversed as well. He finds himself in Hades, or in hell. Let me just read the first part of the story. It's quite short. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple. Dressed in purple just means a luxury. Very much in those days, purple was considered to be it was a very expensive color to manufacture, and so people that wore purple were wealthy. There was a rich man who dressed in purple and fine linen, and who feasted sumptuously every day. At his gate lay a poor man, Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham, and the rich man died and was buried. And the story goes on from there. I find this to be probably the scariest parable that Jesus told. And the reason that I find it scary is because I think if we're going to be honest, we would have to side with the rich man in terms of our relationship with the two in this story. At first blush, we might say, oh, Lazarus, that's more me, because I'm not a rich person. So that must be me. In fact, Gary, I'm not sure if it was you in the office on Friday mentioning that 1%, for 1% of the richest in Canada, that by January 1st of the new year, by 2 o'clock, that 1% will have made $45,000 already. Gary, was that your story, or maybe it was Mark's? It doesn't matter. So within the first 7 or 8 hours of the new year, that top 1% will make as much as most of us will make, or many of us, or the average will make all year long. So we think, well, we're not rich. But the reality is that compared to the rest of the world, we are very wealthy indeed. Even the poorest of us would be considered to be very rich in the eyes of most of the rest of the world, or much of the rest of the world. Even the idea of having 3 meals a day and having a cupboard and fridge full of food would be so foreign to many, many people that they just couldn't understand. William Barclay is one of my favorite commentators, Bible commentators. He's passed away many, many years ago in the 1940s, but some brilliant commentaries. One of the commentaries that he makes, he calls this parable the punishment of the man who did not notice. The punishment of the man who didn't notice. You see, Jesus didn't berate the rich man for being rich. In fact, the Bible tells us that not only are we to go out into labor, but that we are to be paid for our labor. So those that labor more should be paid for that and should be wealthy for that reason. But the thing that Jesus was upset with was that this man didn't notice. Barclay calls this the punishment of the man who didn't notice. That was a sin. That the rich man didn't notice the needs that were around him and respond to them. But that's our sin too, isn't it? In Matthew 25, Jesus said, I was hungry, and you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me nothing to drink. I was sick and in prison, and you didn't visit me. I was naked, and you didn't give me clothes. It was like Jesus was being there in person through these people, and we ignored him. And that's what we do an awful lot. We ignore those that are in great need all around us. I'll never forget the first time that I saw somebody really living in squalor. It happened in Mexico City. Even in Papua New Guinea, where people lived in bush huts, they had their farm, they had their way of life, and it was a way of life that was, in some ways, successful. And there was a measure of comfort. In Mexico City, not only were people living in places that they had just kind of thrown together with whatever tin or cardboard or whatever they could find, but there were no proper toilet facilities. Mexico City is considered, if you're living in Mexico City, to be a death threat. People that have money leave that valley and go off to the next valley over to Cuernavaca or wherever, because to live in Mexico City is a respiratory death sentence. But most of the people that are around us that are hurting, we don't notice. I'd like to just share with you some statistics that I came across that are kind of frightening. 21,000 children die every day of preventable diseases. 21,000 children die every day around the world from hunger, from easily preventable diseases, from poor poverty-related causes. That's one child dying every 4 seconds, which is about as often as we blink. So you can take a period of time and you can count up the number of times that you blink, and there's a child that's dying that's related in terms of intervals to that. That's 14 children every minute. That would be a 2004 Asian tsunami, the Thailand tsunami, occurring every single day. That would be the total population of Kelowna wiped out every 4 days. Or a 2010 Haiti earthquake occurring every 10 days. Can you imagine that there would be a tsunami that would be happening every day, and the number of people that were killed in the tsunami around 20,000? Can you imagine that happening every day, and it doesn't even hit the newspapers? We don't very often hear about the number of people that are killed in such a fashion or die in such a fashion. We don't have newspapers that like 21,000 people died today, or 21,000 people killed today. Over history, the rich have always turned a blind eye to the poor. That's how they assuage their guilt. That's how they cope. Many years ago, I had a business association with somebody that was in North Carolina. And we went down for a training session. And they invited us over to their house for a barbecue. And I went into the very first gated community that I had ever seen. I didn't even know that there were gated communities at that time. And very much, as I traveled through this gated community, we were stopped by the guard, identity checked, and he phoned the fellow that owned the house that we were going to make sure that we were legitimate and that we'd been invited. And we drove through the manicured lawns and the big houses and the high gate with the wire going across the top of the gate. And the community was, of course, very, very white. And the gate was to keep the blacks out. And it occurred to me that if they didn't spend so much of their energy and their focus and their resources on segregation, they'd have much more resources to have a balanced society. And I asked the fellow that I was visiting about this, and he wasn't interested in talking about it. He just turned a blind eye to the situation. The rich man also lived in a gated community. We read that Lazarus was laid at his gate. Lazarus was laid at his gate. And when we say he was laid at his gate, that must imply that he was an invalid. And he needed help, but he wasn't acknowledged by the rich man. Wasn't even noticed by the rich man. But there was the one that did notice him, and that was God. And so Jesus said that the time came that Lazarus died. And I love this. Angels carried him to Abraham's side. In other words, to heaven. It's a great image. It wasn't his family or his friends that came to pick him up outside the beggar's gate, but it was God's angels that came and picked him up and took him to his real home. God cared about him. Somebody else has called this parable the man who made a name for himself and the man who didn't. I like that one. Lazarus made a name for himself. The rich man did. Interesting twist on the way that we see things and the way that God sees things. We certainly see the world different from the way that God does. The rich man was anonymous. Sometimes you'll hear him called Dives. Dives simply means rich man in Latin. So some commentaries will have him called Dives, but that wasn't a name that was given to him. So Jesus gives a name to the beggar and leaves the rich man anonymous. He identified with the beggar. He is the only person that's named in all of the parables. In all of the parables, Jesus never names a particular person, but he gives a name to this poor beggar that we would consider in our society to perhaps be unworthy. But Jesus seemed to identify with that beggar, not with the rich man. The difference is significant. Being known and being honored by God, and not being known and honored by God. Lazarus was known by God. Lazarus' name means God is my helper. I have an admission to make, and that is when I go by somebody who is begging, maybe outside the liquor store, not that I attend that very often, but sometimes a couple of people there that are looking for a little bit of money. Sometimes I find on Cooper and Harvey quite frequently there's somebody out with a cardboard sign. And from time to time I'll throw a tune. But you know, I never ask the person what their name is. Not sure that I particularly want to develop a relationship. But that's what Jesus is talking about here. There was a high school teacher, her name was Gloria Bunch. And Gloria asked her class. She asked her class to name a rich person that they knew. People in the class knew, in the grade 10 class. Somebody put up their hand and said Bill Gates. Somebody else said Donald Trump. Somebody said Oprah. Somebody said, well, those guys from the Middle East. And then she asked them to name somebody that was homeless. She said, "Do you know the name of anybody that's homeless?" The students made vague references to the one guy who sleeps behind the Costco, or that crazy lady who's always asking for change when I come out of McDonald's. And she reads, "We all understand what Jesus was saying. God cares about everybody, even and especially those that society would rather not notice, and definitely not name." By naming Lazarus and not the rich man, Jesus' story contrasts with a worldly understanding of who's who. Again, Jesus reminds us that heaven is the opposite of the world in many respects, especially when it comes to rating an individual's worth in society. The question that we might ask is, why was Dives in hell? You see, God noticed him too, but dealt with him harshly. Particular parable, Jesus doesn't say that he committed any violent sin or that he was cruel. He didn't kick Lazarus. He didn't order Lazarus' removal from his gate. He didn't refuse Lazarus' crumbs. Could well have been a well-liked, well-respected person among his peers in the community that he lived in. But why did Jesus deal with him so harshly? What was his sin? It was the sin of not noticing. And friends, you and I are guilty of that same sin. We turn a blind eye to those that are homeless. We might turn a blind eye to the teenager that we see coming up and down our street that we know is lonely and perhaps doesn't have a friend. Or perhaps a young mother that we see is trying to raise 3 children on her own. The elderly person who gets no visits. This past Friday, 214 people lost their jobs in the factory, chip factory. Old Dutch closed their factory in Montreal. And I wonder, I heard about there was one lady who was in her mid-50s who didn't have her high school education. She was going to go back and get her high school equivalency in her mid-50s so that she could find some work. And I wonder how many of those 214 people will have somebody that really cares about their situation. I remember a number of years ago hearing for the very first time hearing the expression, it's a horrible expression, it sucks to be you. You might have heard that expression. It's a horrible expression. I remember being shocked the first time I heard it. And what's really wrong with that is that contains the sin of being preoccupied with our own concerns, with our own needs, so much so that we don't care about somebody else's needs and somebody else's concerns. And often I, and I suspect you, are guilty of that. There's a professor, Robert Worthnow, who did a very interesting study on why some people are compassionate, some people are concerned about other people, and others are not. And what his conclusion was that typically people that are compassionate are people who have had compassion shown to them. And that then transforms their lives. That sense of somebody caring about them transforms their lives. And Worthnow talks about a fellow by the name of Jack Casey, who grew up in a very hard situation at home. Casey says this about his father. He says, "All I ever learned from my father is that I didn't want to be like him." Wouldn't that be a horrible inheritance to receive from your father? All I learned from my father is that I didn't want to be like him. His father was alcoholic. He was abusive. One time when Jack was a young man, he was scheduled to have surgery. He was terrified of having surgery. But there was a nurse that was with him, and the nurse stayed with him. And before he went into his operation, the nurse said, "I'll be right here, no matter what." And when Jack opened his eyes after the operation, she was there holding his hand. Years later, Jack became a paramedic. Pardon me. And he tells the story of coming across a truck that had flipped over and a man was pinned underneath it. Gasoline was dripping down beside the man. The man himself was terrified. And Jack was right there. And Jack said similar words. I'm here. You're going to be all right. I'm going to be with you. One spark and the whole scene would have gone up in flames. And Jack remembered that time when that nurse, who wouldn't leave him and was with him. And so he took the man's hand, he squeezed it, he says, "Don't worry, I'm right here, and I'm not going anywhere." Days after the rescue, two men embraced, and Jack said, or the man said to Jack, "You know, you were crazy to stay with me. We could have both died." And Jack smiled and said, "I couldn't leave you." And here's the point of the message. That there was a time, spiritually, that there was a time where each of us were beggars lying by the gate, helpless. Christ noticed us. Christ loved us as we were. And when we remember that, we remember God's calling on our life, we look around and we see needs that are everywhere. There are needs all around the world. And we show love and attention to somebody who needs it. And likely, he or she will remember that and show some love and attention to somebody else. And that original love, that original act of love and kindness can extend over and over and over again, potentially forever. But you can't be part of that chain of love and concern if you never look beyond your own cares of love and your own cares of concern. Don't live your life like that rich man, forever being remembered for the one who didn't notice the needs that were around him. Look around you today. Find somebody who is needy. Find somebody who needs the love and the concern and the care that you can offer for them. And don't withhold that. Amen. And amen. Let's pray. Father in heaven, so easy is it to be like the rich man and to ignore the needs that are all around us. And yet you call us to recognize the needs. First of all, to notice the needs. We can't do much about the needs if we don't notice them. So help us first to notice those needs. Help us, secondly, to recognize the fact that you have blessed us in so many ways that we can provide for the needs of others. Even the poorest among us here today can reach out and can help somebody else that's needy. And so let's not cop out by saying that we don't have the resources. We are blessed, each and every one of us. So help us today to extend that arm of help and offering and peace to somebody that needs it. We pray for our troubled world today. We heard of what's happening in West Africa, and we just ask that situations around the world would know that same kind of love and concern that you have for each one of us, and that you would call us to have for one another, as Jesus told us in the parable of Lazarus, that we would treat others as we are to treat the Lazaruses of the world. And so with that in mind, we come before you and we pray that prayer that Jesus taught us to pray, saying, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. Offering will now be received for the